Hello and welcome to Elemental Hardware Enrichment. My name is Aiden and today we're going to be building finger basketball. Before we get started with building, let's go ahead and introduce the supplies that we're going to need for this project. For this project, we're going to need a hammer block, a hardware tray, some sandpaper, a rag for glue cleanup, a bottle of glue, and our safety glasses. Let's go ahead and put those on now. Now that we've got all of our supplies introduced, the next step will be to introduce the tools that we're going to use for this project. All right, we've introduced our supplies, so the next step is going to be to talk about the tools that we're going to need for this project. So I have my toolkit right here. I'm going to go ahead and open it up and take out the tools that I need. For this project, I'm going to need a hammer and a Phillips head screwdriver. Now that I've got all my tools, I can close up my toolkit and get it out of my way. All right, we've got our supplies, we've got our tools, so the next step is going to be to open up the box and talk about the materials that we're going to find inside. All right, let's go ahead and open up our box. To do that, I'm going to be using the edge of my hammer, and I'm just going to slide the claw of the hammer down the tape where the two box flaps meet to split it open. Now that I've split the tape, I can go ahead and grab the corners of the box and pry it up. The first thing I'm going to take out of the box is my packing paper, and I'm just going to open that up to make sure that there's no small pieces wrapped up inside it before I get it out of my way. Now that I've got the paper out of my way, let's go ahead and talk about our different parts. The first thing I'm taking out is this part here, and this will be our post. We have this part here, and this will be our hoop. We also have this piece here, which will be our wedge. We have a bag of hardware, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And the last wood part I'm going to be taking out is the largest piece. And it can be a little tricky to get out, so I'm just going to turn the box over. And I've got this piece here, which is going to be my cord. Now that I've got everything out of the box, let's get it out of our way. All right, we've introduced all of our parts, so the next step is going to be to talk about our hardware. Okay, let's go ahead and open up our hardware bag and talk about what we're going to find inside. So I have my hardware bag right here. I'm going to go ahead and open it up and talk through everything that's in there. The first thing I'm going to take out is my acrylic launcher. I also have a red dot bag. Inside this bag are 2 hex nuts and 2 3/4 inch machine screws. Next, I have a blue dot bag. Inside this blue dot bag, I have 2 3/4 inch wood screws, a 1/2 inch wood screw, and a screw eye. Last thing I'm taking out of the bag is going to be my ball on a string. Now that we've introduced all of our materials and hardware, the next step will be to sand our wood parts to get prepped for building. Let's go ahead and get started sanding. So to sand, I'm going to need my hammer block and my sandpaper. I'm going to be wrapping the sandpaper around the hammer block to form a sanding block. So I'm going to place it right here across the smooth side of the sandpaper and fold both sides of the sandpaper over it just like this. Now that I've done that, I can go ahead and start sanding my wood parts. I'm going to focus primarily on my cord and my wedge. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, I've got the edges of all the wood pieces sanded, so now I'm actually going to be removing the sandpaper from the block, and I'm going to be folding it up and using the very corner to sand out this large through hole in the cord. I've got all my wood pieces nicely sanded, so the last thing I'm going to do is just use my rag to wipe away any dust. All right, our wood pieces are sanded and cleaned up, so now we're ready to get started with our build. The first step of the build is going to be to attach the hoop to our post. Okay, we're ready to begin attaching our hoop to the post. So for that, we're going to need our machine screws and our hex nuts. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my red dot bag and dump them out into my tray. Next, I'm going to locate the 2 pre-drilled holes on my post and the 2 pre-drilled holes on the hoop. Those pre-drilled holes are going to sit right above the rim and are going to be here in the backboard. And you'll notice that these holes are countersunk, which means it's going to allow our screws to sit flush against the backboard. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and lay the post down on my work surface so that those pre-drilled holes face up, and then I'm going to rest the hoop on top of it so that the pre-drilled holes in the backboard align over the top of those holes in the post. Once I have them lined up, I'm going to hold this in place and go ahead and set my screws. From there, I can use my screwdriver to screw the screws down. Once I've got those machine screws screwed in as tightly as I can, I'm going to go ahead and attach the hex nuts. So I'm going to be flipping this over so that I can see the exposed end of my screws. I'm then going to grab one of my hex nuts and I'm going to screw it onto that end of the screw using my fingers. I'm just going to screw it on as tightly as I can, and then I'll move on to the next one. Once I've got those as tight as I can with my fingers, I want to finish them off with my screwdriver. Before I do that, I want to double check that my hoop is straight. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to be pinching one of these hex nuts with my non-dominant hand, and I'm going to be screwing in the machine screw with my screwdriver. So I'm pinching this in place, and then I'm using the screwdriver to tighten the screw. And I'm just going to be tightening this until the hex nut begins to pull out of my grip. Once it does, that means it's as tight as it'll get. So I'll move on to the next one. I'll pinch the hex nut and tighten down the screw. Once I've got both of those screws as tight as I can get them, the hoop is now secured to my post. So I'm ready to move on to my next step, which will be to attach my post to my cord. All right, let's go ahead and attach the post to our cord. Now before we do that, we want to prep the bottom side of the post by beveling it slightly so it's going to fit more easily into this hole. We're going to do that by using our sandpaper and our hammer block. So I'm going to reset this. And then I'm going to go ahead and hold the sandpaper with the sanding block at about a 45-degree angle and rest it against the end of the post opposite from the hoop. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the sandpaper up and down against the edge of the post while I rotate the post in my fingers to evenly bevel it all the way around. And I'm going to do that for about 15 seconds. Now what I've done is rounded over the edge of this post or beveled it to make it easier to set into this hole. So what I'm going to do now is get prepared to set the post into the cord. So I'm going to be removing the red cap from my glue, and I'm going to be setting some glue around the beveled edge of the post. I don't want to get it directly on the bottom of the post because that's not going to be making contact with the cord. I want to instead get it around this edge. I'm going to go ahead and set some glue here on the top, and then I'll be spreading that around evenly using my finger. Once I've got the glue all spread out, I can clean my fingers off. And then I'm going to go ahead and set the glued edge of the post over this hole in the cord. Now it's very important that I make sure that my hoop is facing the opposite end of the cord and that I'm setting the post in so that the hoop is straight. So I'm going to take my time to really line everything up before I hammer it in. All right, that looks good right about there. I'm just going to give it a slight adjustment, and then I'm going to hold it in place with my non-dominant hand so it doesn't move, and I'm going to be tapping it down with my hammer until the bottom of the post makes contact with the work surface. And I don't know if you could hear that, but the sound kind of changes once it's fully set into the hole. What I can do then is flip this over and just double check that it's flush with the bottom there. And the last thing I'm going to do is just wipe up any excess glue. And just like that, I've finished setting my post into my cord. So I'm ready to move on to the next step, which will be to attach my wedge. Let's go ahead and attach our wedge. Now, if you look on the opposite side of the court from the hoop, you'll notice that there are two pre-drilled holes in the court, and that's where we're going to be attaching the wedge. So let's go ahead and take a look at our wedge now. If you look at this slanted edge, you'll notice that there are two pre-drilled holes on either side and one directly in the middle. These two holes on the side have these slopes around them, which again, similar to our backboard, are countersinks or countersunk holes, which are going to allow our screws to sit flush against the wedge. So what I'm going to be doing is flipping the wedge over, and I'm going to be applying glue to this opposite side. And I just kind of want to put it right between those two holes on the edge. Once I've got the glue on there, I can spread it around evenly with my finger, and then I'm going to wipe my finger clean. Now I'm going to go ahead and set the wedge onto the court so that the sloped or slanted edge of the wedge is facing towards my hoop. So maybe I'll turn this so you guys can see a little bit better, and I'm just going to be placing this right down. So again, the flat edge of the wedge is towards the outside of the court, and the slanted edge is going towards my hoop. Now what I'm going to be doing is moving this around to align these holes on the outside of the wedge with the holes in my court. So I'm just going to take a minute to line everything up. Once I've got it lined up, I'm going to kind of press it down into place. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up my blue hardware bag. Inside this bag, I have my two 3/4 inch wood screws, my 1/2 inch wood screw, and my screw eye. I'm going to be using the two 3/4 inch wood screws for this step. So again, I'm going to double check that I have my wedge lined up over the holes in the court, and then I'm going to hold it in place with my non-dominant hand and use my dominant hand to set my screws. And I don't have to set them too deeply, I just want them standing up in the hole like that. Once I have my screws set in place, I'm going to double check that my wedge is aligned. I'm going to continue to hold it in place with my non-dominant hand, and I'm going to go ahead and screw those in. Now before I screw that first screw down all the way, I'm going to stop so that I can still kind of pivot this back and forth and make sure that it's straight. So I'm going to realign everything, and then I'm going to go ahead and screw the second screw all the way down. And then I'll finish off my first screw. When you're finished, you want to make sure that the screws sit flush inside those holes on the wedge, and that the wedge sits flush against the court. And then if you need to, you can go ahead and wipe up any excess glue. What we're going to do next is we're going to go ahead and attach our launcher. So I'm going to find my launcher right here. And when I'm using this launcher, I'm going to be running my finger against it a lot, so I want to make sure that it's got a nice smooth edge on it. So what I'm going to do really quickly is just run my sandpaper over the edge of the launcher at a little bit of an angle to smooth it out. Once I've done that on one side, I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. Now that I've got that edge nice and smooth, I want to take a look at the smaller hole on my launcher. You'll notice that one side of the hole is slightly beveled or slanted, which means that it's countersunk like the holes in our wedge and our hoop. And we want to make sure that that countersunk hole is facing up so that our screw will sit flush against the launcher. I'm going to make sure that that countersunk hole is facing up, and I'm going to line it up over the pre-drilled hole in the center of my wedge. I'm then going to be grabbing the 1/2 inch wood screw from my parts tray, and I'm going to set that into the hole. Once I've got it set in place, I'm going to hold the launcher in place and go ahead and screw that down. Once I've got that screw so that it's flush with the edge of the launcher, I can go ahead and test the launcher, and it should be nice and tight, but I should still be able to adjust it back and forward to adjust my shot. Now that I've got that securely attached, I'm ready to move on to the next step, which will be to attach my screw eye and my ball. All right, we're ready to go ahead and attach our screw eye and our ball. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my screw eye, and I'm going to be screwing it into this pre-drilled hole right here at the base of the hoop. It should be pretty simple to do. I'm just going to hold it right over the hole and screw it in. So I'm turning it clockwise. Once I have it set, I'm just going to screw it all the way down. And I'm just going to screw it in until I can't screw it any further, and it should be perfectly set into the hole and nice and tight and snug. Now I'm going to go ahead and grab my ball, and I'm going to be placing the ball onto the large hole on the launcher, and then feeding my string through the screw eye. I want to pull the string until there's just a tiny bit of slack. I don't want to pull it so tight that it's going to pull the ball off the launcher, but I want to leave the ball on the launcher and just leave myself a little bit of slack. Once I've got it to the right place, I'm going to hold it in place and go ahead and tie a knot. Once I've got the knot in there, I'm actually going to double knot it. Now that I've got my knot nice and tight, I can go ahead and add a drop of glue to lock that knot in place. And just like that, my finger basketball project is finished. Now I'm super excited to get to play with this, but I want to give this some time to dry so I don't get glue all over my ball. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and plan and decorate this project, and then I'll be right back. All right, I got my project all decorated. I decided to go with some red paint and just a couple of lines on the court to make it look like a real basketball court. And now I'm ready to play with it. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and take the ball and place it on the large hole on the launcher. I'm then going to use either my index finger or my thumb to pull the launcher down and fling the ball at the hoop until I can score it. So let's go ahead and try it out. And with enough practice, you'll be shooting it like a pro in no time. I had a really great time building this with you guys on Elemental Hardware Enrichment. My name is Aiden, and I'm looking forward to seeing you on the next one.